All right, we're here with Don Leonard, running for, I'm going to get this right, the Ohio 15th.
You got it.
I'm in the 15th district. I should know this, but because of Republican gerrymandering, we've got a Republican congressman by Mike Carey. He's living down in German Village with his MAGA credentials, doing God knows what in German Village. It's funny how they always like the plus 75 Joe Biden districts, but that's neither here nor there. Today's about you, my friend. Full disclosure, Hilltop Husband is a campaign donor. Some of my wifely allowance went into his pocket. But we're still going to do the journalistic thing today, treat him with integrity, ask the hard-hitting questions. Don, thanks for sitting down, brother.
It's a pleasure.
I guess we'll start. Why do you want to run for Congress? Why do you want to go with cocaine orgies and Washington?
Besides those two, right? It's funny, DJ. The first time somebody asked me that question, I totally choked. I mean, there's just so much shit in the last 12 months that came rolling down. I mean, I've been a professor at Ohio State for the last 10 years. Trump's first act upon taking office, seems to me, was to go attacking the universities, top research universities like mine. And in February, he's deporting international students who were here totally legally because they had the audacity to think that they were able to protest something like the genocide in Gaza, right? By April, they were deporting documented people of any stripe just because they didn't like the cut of their jib, shall we say, sending to some gulag in El Salvador. And then the straw that broke the camel back for me was back in June. Mike Carey, the Republican who's currently sitting in this seat for Ohio 15, voted and bragged about voting for Trump's big, beautiful bill, saying it was needed deficit reduction for the financial health of our children. I don't have to tell you, but some of your listeners might know, that thing cut $1 trillion from our Medicaid rolls. That means 47% of the kids in our district now have their health care at risk. And that's personal for me. I was raised by a single mom. In the recession in '93, we got our butts kicked, and I ended up crashing my bike, and it was $14,000 of Medicaid to put my right wrist back together. So, we were already sort of talking about it. My wife and I were talking with friends about it on a scale of 1 to 10, how stupid is this idea? And then, the Minnesota lawmakers had just been shot, and we were realizing just what the stakes were of doing something like this. I've got a 1-year-old daughter at home, but when he made that move against Medicaid, it just absolutely fired me up. But that's all kind of too long of an answer for those folks on the campaign trail. So the biggest one for me, I say, is just my daughter. Man, I've got like Papa Bear hormones coursing through my veins. I'm looking at, I'm a political scientist by training. I've studied how dictatorship and inequality go hand in hand and go down this dark path that I see America going down right now. If we don't get in early and shut this down, I don't want to see what a J.D. Vance or a Marco Rubio has to add to this equation.
Yeah, you gotta be, as a student of history, right? Like, people don't really, it sounds like Chicken Little.
Yeah.
To like the average person.
You look out your window right now, the buses are still running, the
exactly,
stock market's booming.
We love our Dow's over 50,000.
Yeah.
But it's the wealth inequality is such that I remember I've been around for years. It just gets to a certain point, breeds the right wing fascism that we saw in Europe, and thankfully, Trump. I'll give Trump this. Nobody makes the hogs stomp like Trump, but you can never underestimate, the Democrats' ability to lose.
Yes.
In our lifetime.
And that's been, sitting on the sidelines thinking that it was enough to vote and volunteer and teach the next generation, and just watching the Democratic Party capitulate time after time. It's like we're in this defensive crouch, and we just think if we moderate a little bit more, if we concede, if we go Republican light just a little bit more, and I'm not talking about every Democrat here, but there are these corporate Democrats in Washington who just absolutely are bankrolled by the same people that bankroll the Republicans, and it starts getting to be a real echo chamber.
Yeah, I've always said that, when you get to, I'm never one of those guys like, both parties are the same. There's definitely stark differences. And not electing all Democrats would turn us into a utopia, but when you get to the top, the son of the Chuck Schumers, the Hakeem Jeffries, are you a fan of Hakeem Jeffries? Like, what kind of direction are you going to want to take the party?
I think, Hakeem is new to the scene. He inherited some bad habits, I think, coming out of the Pelosi era. So my jury's still out on him. He eventually came around and recognized that the people of New York chose someone like Mamdani. The Democratic Party ought not fight that.
Yeah.
Chuck Schumer, he's been there a long time. We've been trying the same thing, expecting different results. He ought to know better. He said something in 2016 in the run-up to that monumental election that really pissed me off. He said, for every blue-collar Democrat, you can look this up, for every blue-collar Democrat that we lose in Western Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Michigan, we're going to pick up 2 Republicans in the suburbs. I say, how's that working out for us right now, Mitch?
Yeah, especially in Ohio. That's always, you meet the old school Democrats, especially in Appalachian, Ohio, and how we've kind of like lost the ability to talk.
The voters have no idea who's supposed to be representing working families anymore. They are absolutely mind-boggled.
Yeah, like when I was in the trades, you see like steel workers with like Ted Cruz stickers.
That's
right. Like, what's going on?
That's right. No, we're looking for America first. I think, in the benefit of Democrats, everybody's scratching their head right now, trying to figure out how bombing a girls' school in Iran is somehow America first. But I truly believe that, making the hog stomp, Trump and the Republican Party succeeded in persuading a lot of blue-collar Americans that they were the ones who were going to start putting the American people over, I think a false choice fundamentally, which is U.S. global leadership. We're retreating from our global leadership. We see instability all around the world, and we think that that's the price of American prosperity. And like you were saying earlier, it's about the inequality, stupid. The best book I ever read in my graduate studies was this book that fundamentally claimed you cannot have democracy under the condition of extreme inequality. Wealth is power. And these folks, they don't just buy access, they get to write the operating system. When you get to that level of morbidly wealthy, individuals.
Do you back things like what's your solution to the Supreme Court?
Man, I get really nervous when I hear Democrats talking about court packing,
Yeah.
bumping up the numbers. Like, where does that stop? So then, Republicans come into office and we go from 20 Supreme Court justices to 30. I've heard some persuasive arguments that the country's grown, so maybe the number of justices should grow, but we should do that sort of not unilaterally, but through some kind of process. I still think that the rationale behind it is sound, which is that the Republicans have stolen at least one Supreme Court seat and by refusing to allow Obama to seat his nominee, Merrick Garland, back in the day. And a reckoning is deserved. But I think there's a larger problem here, which is that the Supreme Court, with the small exception of the Warren Court years after World War II, the Supreme Court has always been the conservative boat anchor dragging behind the will of the American people. You look at its rulings on slavery, on women's rights, it has always been behind the will of the people, and in that sense, fundamentally undemocratic. A lot of that, I think, traces back to a power that the Supreme Court was not granted in the Constitution under Article 3. It was assumed in this case, Marbury versus Madison in the early 1800s, where they basically wanted to dodge a constitutional crisis by saying, you know what, the Supreme Court decides that law was not constitutional, so that right of judicial review, that power of judicial review that the Supreme Court exercises, it's the same one that tried Obamacare and got to decide that no, the federal government cannot compel people in America to buy health insurance, right? We cannot force them to buy health insurance. That very claim rested upon this assumed power of judicial review. I think we need to take another look at that, and I find that to be a much more compelling argument as compared to something that boils down to court packing.
They got the corruption problem too.
Big time.
Thomas.
Yeah.
I think it's just illegitimate.
Well, the whole thing, I mean, again, when you have these wealthy billionaires, the laws of political and economic gravity just don't apply to them, whisking, these characters around. That same book I told you about, Oligarchy by Jeffrey Winters, if you only read one book in political science, I think this is the book. He talks about, oligarchy isn't rule by the wealthy, it's that they purchase middle-class people like me and make them feel special, wine and dine them, jet them around, make it financially possible for them to crawl out of their, humble beginnings and make a name for themselves. And they don't rule directly; they rule through. Marco Rubio has his sob story about his childhood. Don Leonard has his, right? And these oligarchs come along and they get to play us like puppets. And that's the corruption that's playing, whisking Clarence Thomas around and jets to the Caribbean, right? And then on top of that, you have the massive conspiracy hiding in plain sight, which is the Federalist Society. This is a group funded by billionaires. It's been holding free luncheons for broke law school students all across this country since the 1980s, grooming them to believe two fundamental lies. Number one, that money is free speech. And number two, that corporations are people when it comes to the political process. The ruling of Citizens United, that, it wasn't the first thing to break our democracy in terms of campaign finance, but it set the precedent for the kind of super PACs that we see today. That ruling was purchased by individuals who either were directly members of or affiliated with the Federalist Society, handpicked by Leonard Leo, the head of the Federalist Society in the 2000s under the Bush administration. And they used to hide it back then. Now under Trump, Leonard Leo's in the White House.
Yeah.
He's not even hiding it.
And he's got an Epstein problem himself.
Does he?
Speaking of Epstein, I'm in Columbus, Ohio. How do you feel about Leslie Wexner, Epstein files? Have you gotten into it? What's your general take?
Again, I'm not a traditional politician. When we were getting ready to run this race and filing our ballot petition, we realized I hadn't voted in a Democratic primary since like 2018. Okay. I'm just one of these...
in Ohio, it's not like...
I'm in a blue bubble. I just go into the ballot box, take my, sample ballot, check off all these judges that I never heard of. So again, I really coming to this with wide eyes. I think what's really clear is you judge a person by the company they keep. And the number of people who continued keeping company with Epstein after he was convicted of sex trafficking with minors, after more and more information started becoming revealed, after his suicide even, and just really failing to divest themselves of this dirty money. Now that I'm no longer an employee of OSU, I don't know if I told you, I resigned my faculty position back in January to be able to speak truth to power about things like this. They need to rip Wexner's name off of every single building on campus and build a statue of it so we never forget. That's where I'm at on this.
I'm sure Ted Carter's going to get right on. I'll get that on his agenda later today when I see it.
The thing that really hurts me about Ted Carter is, hearing our state level politics. It wasn't just the Trump administration and his goons with Project 2025 that were coming after higher education. The most important thing on the agenda of the Ohio State Senate last year, Senate Bill 1, coming out of the gate, was how do we choke off one of our state's most powerful and important institutions, our public universities.
Yeah, so we parks, libraries, we tend to do those well in Ohio. Universities they want to go after.
So let's just
what was that like with the SB1 from professorship?
It was, I resigned to run this race before it was implemented, but I say that with an asterisk, and this is what gets back to Ted Carter. You've heard this expression, anticipatory compliance.
Yeah.
Even before SB1 had been implemented in the summer of 25, Ted Carter was shutting down every single diversity, equity, and inclusion program on the campus, including the one that I was running for my unit in the Knowlton School. And, here we are. We went from saying, man, this DEI stuff, it's so corporatized, it's so ineffective, how do we make this really meaningful, to having to stand up and fight for those three words because our president had decided to anticipatorily comply with the state Senate ruling before it had ever become law.
Yeah. I think that's why, because he was like the third or fourth pick for those guys. Because a lot of the red state presidency of these institutions used to be a prestigious job. It's not so prestigious now because you got to fundraise, you got to hobnob with guys like Epstein, and then on top of it, you've got the angry grandfathers who think that their grandchildren won't talk to them because they went to college and took a class from you, and they want to do something about it.
Yeah. So I think this is a dangerous moment for our state. This is a dangerous moment for our country. There's a lot of bandwagoning happening right now. We've talked to some unions, I won't say which, who are actively considering bandwagoning with the Republicans this coming November because they think this is just going to be the new normal. The Democrats are imploding. We've got to make peace with the least worst Republicans we can.
Yeah.
And they see somebody like my Republican opponent, Mike Carey, as among the least worst. Obviously, I have some things to say about that.
Yeah, the way he just, I guess it speaks to a talent, talent as a politician. That he has this, it's like a moderate. Oh, he's like he's moderate. But when push comes to shove, I can't recall him ever saying anything on the record about Trump, but pushing back, casting any meaningful vote about any of it.
He can. Trump is the reason he has that seat. I don't know if you know this, DJ, but he was not somebody who came up from within the Ohio Republican Party. He was not endorsed in his primary race. He was endorsed by was Donald Trump.
Yeah.
The coal lobby, Kerry remains the number one recipient of coal lobby dollars. The coal lobby funneled a bunch of money to Donald Trump in 2021 in exchange for him to endorse their boy Mike Carey. So he is now the coal lobbyist on the inside of Congress at the behest of Donald Trump. How is he going to bite the hand that fed him?
And then living in German Village. I keep going. Always
watching the squirrels jump through the trees.
The amount of Ohio Republicans that live down there that are active, especially in state politics, they love Lindy's. Lindy's, if these guys had $1 billion, they would fly Lindy's into Naples. They love Naples so much, they love Lindy's. Shifting gears, Israel is a topic du jour, especially among the Democratic primary.
100%.
What's your take on Israel? You use the word genocide out of the gate. That's kind of been a benchmarker for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I don't like benchmarkers. I don't like purity politics. But I think, look, what Hamas did on October 7th was a horrific act of terrorism, and it deserved to be put to an end. What the Netanyahu regime has done to the innocent civilians of Gaza, there's lots of hurt happening all over the world. And before anybody asked me what my opinion was on whether Gaza was a genocide or not, I just put on my international relations training. And I'm like, well, is it an act of war? Is it a crime against humanity? Is it a genocide? But when talking to my constituents here in Ohio, and them pointing me to the UN investigations by independent UN agencies, here's what got it for me. An Israeli tank parked itself outside of an abandoned IVF clinic, an in vitro fertilization clinic in the heart of Gaza. It was clearly marked and sprayed that this is an IVF clinic, a fertility clinic. And they fired a tank shell into that clinic, destroying 4,000 fertilized embryos. The definition of genocide, one of the key criteria, is preventing future generations from coming online. The only reason my wife and I have a daughter is because of in vitro fertilization. That's why when Mike Carey goes co-sponsoring a nationwide abortion ban with no exceptions for all of the horrific things that can come to pass for a woman or for IVF treatment, that's why when I read things like that being perpetrated, I have admiration for the folks who are members of the Israeli Defense Forces because they don't volunteer. Everyone in Israel is compelled to serve, and they're being ordered to do horrific things by the Netanyahu regime.
Is that a defense?
What in defense?
I've been ordered. I'm just taking orders.
No, we know
it didn't work out for the Nazis.
We know from Nuremberg that it's no defense. We know from the Geneva Convention on War that it's not a defense. What I think is terrible, and listen, I'm the generation of Iraq and Afghanistan, right? I never served in those wars. I had an opportunity, and I thought deliberately about it, like anyone who came online who was an adult during 9/11. But I just looked at what the U.S. was doing in Iraq, and I said, this is an illegal war with no legitimacy whatsoever. I opted to, join the U.S. Peace Corps and serve in South America instead of, serving overseas. I have immense respect for the soldiers who went there and fought. It's not their fault, just like back in Vietnam, right? It's not the soldiers' fault that they're deployed and put into situations that they never should have been in by politicians who are, working on an agenda that has nothing to do with U.S. national security, right? It's what we see in Iran right now. The American service members that I see who served in my generation are on YouTube saying, yeah, we've seen this movie before, no more blood for oil.
Yeah.
So listen, and full disclosure, while being transparent, my wife is Jewish, my daughter's Jewish, right? I will always stand for defending the Israeli people. But if the Israeli government is going to use U.S. military assistance to commit a genocide against Palestinians, if anyone anywhere is using U.S. military assistance to commit humanitarian violence against civilians anywhere, yeah, we're going to pull that plug. In the case of Israel, it's a tough neighborhood. If we have to park the Fifth Fleet off the coast of Tel Aviv and set up our own missile defense shield for them, we can do that. But until Netanyahu is ripped out of that building and brought to justice, I think the United States has to revise its willingness to support and assist in this humanitarian crime, and that includes withholding offensive military equipment to Israel until such time as they suspend these horrific acts, not just in Gaza, but the increasing, the state is supporting or even condoning militias in the West Bank, right? It's no longer just a steady encroachment, the slowly turning up the heat on the frog in the pot. They are officially sanctioning these militia to go in and harass Palestinian people by their inaction. So if the United States is going to protect the Israeli people, we've got to protect them from the Netanyahu regime right now.
You're drawing the line of defensive and offensive weapons, like the military, in terms of military.
Up until a week ago, there was a country on the other side of the Persian Gulf, Iran, that had a lot of ballistic missiles pointed at Israel, right? And has a, violent one-state solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is, push Israel into the Mediterranean, right? So I think protecting the descendants of the victims of the Holocaust from Iranian ballistic missiles was and remains an important priority of the United States. So when I think about, defensive weapons, I'm thinking about the ability to protect civilian populations everywhere from these assaults. What I'm super curious about with the Trump administration and all these, Marco Rubio going into Venezuela, going into Iran, I think Cuba's next, that's the one Marco really wants to go after, right, is where's the love for Ukraine? Here are innocent civilians being massacred by the Russians? Are you kidding me? Right next, I'm a kid of the Cold War. I was born in '78. When I came online, it was learning about concepts like, mutual assured destruction and this idea that we were going to turn into, a big desert after a huge nuclear exchange, right? If there's anything besides a hatred of fascism in American political DNA, it ought to be skepticism towards Russian expansionism, right? And here's Russia expanding and the Trump administration deliberating on whether or not we want to help somebody who's a next door neighbor to our NATO allies. I think we have to be consistent in the application of our foreign policy, and that includes protecting the civilians in Israel, protecting the civilians in Ukraine, and anywhere else. And, to the extent that, we're sending missile shields for Ukraine, I think we need to be sending a lot more of them. I do think that the Israeli people are worthy of defensive, Iron Dome is what they call it, right? Type protections. I have heard the argument that these things are fungible. A supporter actually told me, we're here in my campaign office right now, literally in the small conference room over there yesterday, like, every dollar they don't have to spend on defensive weapons, they get to spend on the tanks that blow up IVF clinics. I get it.
Israel bonds?
What's that?
The Israel bonds, the investment in the Israel bonds, you support that?
Look, Israel is teetering right on the absolute brink of converging with South Africa in terms of being an apartheid state, and that was.
I would say it is.
And that was, and even the South African state didn't commit explicit genocide. It was structural violence, right, in South Africa.
They didn't have nuclear weapons either.
Well, yeah, South Africa's the question mark. But here again, we've had some real hand-wringing about this, and what brings me clarity is that my Jewish wife is telling me, yes, it's a genocide, right? Yes, it's an apartheid state. Yes, we have got to prevent the very same forms of violence that originally drove the Jewish people to Israel in the first place. And that's what hurts me the most. I remember the day I became pro-Israeli. I was like 13 years old. I was reading this historical book on World War II. It was a fictional account, but it was talking about, all the tanks and bombs and, ships that kids like, right, for whatever reason. And then it took one of our central characters' grandfather through Auschwitz and put him in the gas chamber. And I wept. I had to put the book down and I wept. And in that moment, it was like the loss of your boyish innocence, right? The realization that adults in this world would sit back and permit something like that to happen. I think part of the reason that the U.S. will always be forever an ally to the people of Israel is because we sat back and did nothing when that Holocaust happened. So imagine how much it pisses me off when I see them treating the settlement, the Palestinian communities in the West Bank like the ghettos in Warsaw. And now the Jewish people are being turned into the occupiers. There's this phenomenal documentary, if you or your viewers have never seen it, called The Gatekeepers, where they interview every single former head of the Israeli Internal Security Services, the Shin Bet. Now, some of them came out of labor governments and they were a little more humanitarian, progressive, I'll say. Some of them were out of Likud and they were just like, Team Israel, fuck yeah. To a T, every single one of them said that what Israel is doing right now in its occupations is a strategic threat to the survival of the state of Israel. Israel cannot endure if they keep operating the way they've been operating, not just since Netanyahu.
You think the problem gets solved with Netanyahu?
The problem did not start with Netanyahu. You go back to the late 90s when you had Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin getting Nobel Prizes because we were within inches, right? I think it was the Helsinki Accords of solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and getting that two-state solution. Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli terrorist for getting that far, and then his successor, Ehud Barak, I think was his name.
He's all over the Epstein files. Yeah, they were doing. He had a direct line to Epstein. They were doing weapons deals.
Yeah, this whole, oh my gosh. If somebody handed Hollywood a script, people would be like, this is garbage. Nobody will ever play this. It's just totally. Ehud Barak blew up the peace accords because the Israelis refused to give up total control over the city of Jerusalem. Palestinians are willing to turn the city of Jerusalem into some kind of Vatican, some kind of internationally administered place where all faiths, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, can worship and pray. It's the Israeli government going back to at least, Ehud Barak, who are unwilling to settle on the status of Jerusalem. That remains the crux of our inability. The U.S., fair weather fan of the state of Israel, moved our embassy from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv in part to help drive forward this peace process, right? And nudge the Israelis to
They moved it to Jerusalem, didn't they?
I thought that they moved it out of Jerusalem to
Okay.
Tel Aviv. I might be wrong on that one. I am not a professor of Middle East politics. I do international development for a living. Like I said, I'm just a citizen who reads the newspaper and tries to understand what all these forces are. But, I think it's a false choice to say that, to support the Palestinians means to abandon the Israeli people and their defense. The Palestinians will not achieve the state that they desire and that they deserve until the Israeli people feel a measure of security. I don't think we get there by the United States enabling Israel, like enabling a drunken friend to just keep going on a tear.
Not that I would know about enabling a drunken friend. But yeah, I mean, they're trying to invade Lebanon, right? They're telling people living in South Lebanon to get out. And
look, when I was an undergrad,
the parallels are getting a little crazy.
When I was an undergrad going through Middle East politics, there was this Israeli kid in my class, and it was awesome because he would be able to give us live what his take on this peace process was in the late 90s. He flat out told us Ariel Sharon could never be prime minister of Israel because he was a war criminal in southern Lebanon. And there was no way that the Israeli people, and then the second Intifada starts right after Ehud Barak destroys the peace process. And that's where we get Ariel Sharon and this sort of collapse within the Israeli society. Again, in the same kind of defensive crouch that I think the Democrats are just politically here in the United States, which is just, it's us versus them and we can't cede an inch.